Okay, hello, this is Joe Kelty in CI 5550, and this is my book review. The title of the book is The Power of the Adolescent Brain by Thomas Armstrong. In my book summary, I've got three slides that address my summary, and you can see here there's a photo of the front of the book, The Power of the Adolescent Brain. It was a really good book. It presented research-based approaches to improve education for students in middle grade age group. And there's a lot of references to adolescent neurological development and research studies, which was interesting because he got right into an understanding of research of brain and neurological issues. And so I got a little concerned that maybe this was going to be a difficult book to read, but it was actually very easy to read and very easy to comprehend. Plus, he has a really good sense of humor. In one of the examples, when he was in class, he was teaching some young adolescents, and they were creating posters with slogans on them. And one of the students had his slogan, and it said, parents treat you like a pet. And so he said, right off the bat, I knew I was dealing with, some emotionally charged young adolescents. And he goes, and understanding brain development and why they're emotionally charged is very helpful as an educator. So here's another slide on book summary. So again, he begins with a review of scientific and medical findings about adolescent brain development, but he does it in a really easy to understand way. He assesses the educational practices that we currently use in more traditional schools and says, they're really not compatible with what we're learning about adolescent needs and brain development. So he presents ideas and strategies and recommendations that would align educational practices with how an adolescent brain needs to learn or wants to learn. And so that obviously would empower educators to be able to teach better and help motivate students because the information presented to them is going to be more aligned with the way their mind works at that time in their development. Some of the topics that he talks about to do this are give students more choices and help them with activities that promote self-awareness in themselves, that promote peer learning or metacognitive skills, which we'll discuss later, or expressive arts and real-world experiences. What's the real world like and how can we relate to it? Finally, in my book summary, I'll talk a little bit about the author, Thomas Armstrong. He's a PhD. He has 40 years of experience in education and learning and teaching. He's a psychologist. He's written 16 books on education, and he's given over 1,000 presentations on learning and development in the US and actually around the world. Really good author. Okay, what are my key takeaways? I have three main key takeaways from the book, which are useful to the educational community. The first one is through reading this book, you get a better understanding of adolescent brain development. Number two, you will receive some suggested specific strategies for motivating students to learn and participate in their own education. And you will also have some suggested approaches to stimulate metacognition, which is essentially abstract thinking. So I've got a few slides on each one of those three key takeaways. Here's the first one on adolescent brain development. So there are new discoveries about the cognition in young adolescents so that we can understand how they learn as their brains develop at this age range. And so he goes back and says at the age of 3, a toddler, their brains do what he calls self-pruning, and they eliminate synapses in the brain which are not needed or which are not being used because of the environment that the toddler is in. So for example, I guess if the toddler doesn't need to hunt, well, I guess a toddler wouldn't hunt, but if they aren't doing certain things like language, that learning multiple languages, then the synapses that would be used for that are kind of released by the brain and pruned so that the brain can be more efficient and not have additional synapses hanging around that aren't really used. So it kind of prunes itself to be more efficient. That pruning stops for several years and then continues again in the adolescent years. So in the prefrontal cortex And he used the term neuroplasticity. The brain is plastic and evolving according to the environment around it. Fascinating stuff. And he says, look, the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal lobe area, it handles a lot of rational thinking, planning. When we're planning things, when we're making decisions, we're establishing priorities and strategies, or if we have impulses to do something and we need to control our behavior, a lot of that is rational thinking from the frontal lobe. And that's where this development is happening in adolescence. Additionally, on the next slide, there's the limbic system, and that is often called the emotional brain. So it works alongside the rational frontal lobe, and so the limbic system and the frontal lobe work together. One's more rational, one's more emotional. So he provides an analogy and says, think of the limbic system like the gas pedal of a car, and think of the frontal lobe as the steering wheel and the brakes. So an adolescent then, in the analogy, has the gas pedal pressed to the floor, right? The emotional brain is working really, really hard, but the brakes and the frontal lobe isn't fully functional. It's not steering really well. It's not slowing down well. It's functioning, but not fully functioning. And so in social contexts, an adolescent is emotionally charged, emotionally reactive, gas pedal to the floor, and doesn't rely as well on their rational faculties to control that behavior. And so understanding that as an educator is really important. So it's really a good book. So that was one of my takeaways. The second takeaway is motivating students to learn. Wouldn't that be great if you were able to do that? And he says, well, look, it's ironic that we want to do things as educators like teaching decision-making skills, but we don't often provide choices for the students related to how we plan the class and the lesson or the activities that we're going to do. What if we provided choices for them so that they could be making decisions and learning decision-making skills, which is what we're trying to teach them in the first place. So he brings up some really interesting points. He says, look, if they're not making choices that can affect them positively or negatively, then they're going to feel powerless to do anything. And then they may disengage from the learning process. That's the opposite of motivating. So if that happens, gosh, well, they might start skipping class. They may eventually drop out of school, and none of that's going to be helpful, obviously. This is down here at the bottom of the page. I've referenced some of the research that he references in the book that applied to my slides. So I thought I'd just put that in there. In addition to motivating students, as part of motivating students, he gives strategies in chapters 3 to 7 for educators to include the students in these decisions that can be helpful. For example, if they build those skills, then they will be better ready for the responsibilities and the complexities of adult life. So what types of things can we do? Well, we could help them make a choice. How do you want to do your homework? You have to do homework on a certain subject, but the approach to doing the homework can be varied, and you can choose which approach to take. Or we have several books that we need to read. You don't have to read all of them, but you need to pick a few of them. You get to pick which books you're going to read. You make that decision. You can poll the students in class. Hey, everyone, how do you feel about this? There's a couple ways we could approach this lesson. Would you like to do it this way or that way? Give them some ownership of it. Give them some decision making. They could create their own projects. You could have activities where they learn at their own pace. You could help them with the opportunity to make decisions that affect school policy. How empowering would that be? You could help them with opportunities to collaborate with other fellow students. Various types of peer interaction are always helpful and exciting for them at this stage, or sometimes independent study is something that's useful. Again, here at the bottom, some more research citations. And so my third key takeaway is stimulating metacognition. So Jean Piaget recognized that adolescents for the first time start to experience this type of thinking, and he calls it formal operational stage. And basically it's the ability and the capacity to think abstractly. And young adolescents are experiencing this for the first time. Here's some examples of abstract thinking. To learn something and then create a thesis or a hypothesis that says, if this is so, then maybe that must be so. And so I'm going to formulate a hypothesis based on knowledge that I learned over here, and I'm going to apply it in another area. Another example of abstract thinking like this is algebra and mathematics. If I give you a formula with variables, x and y, if x equals 2y, then what do you know about x and y? And can you solve what the variable represents? A third way to explain abstract thinking would be to think about thinking itself and talk about that with your students. So when I bring this up, what did you think about? And let's talk about why you reacted that way. So it's a way of, you know, exercising your abstract thinking abilities. It was Piaget's apprentice, or one of his chief proteges, named John Flavel, who was the first psychologist to actually call this metacognition, and that's the more used term these days. So formal operational stage if you're doing a research project on Jean Piaget, but we will refer to it as metacognition. And again, he defined it as really the ability to manage your own thinking with a degree of control. And another way to say it is abstract thinking. And here's another reference to some research there. The author proposes useful ways that we can stimulate this metacognition in our students. Some of the ways are, well, how do you engage in critical thinking? Well, you could ask open-ended questions in class and have discussion time. You could brainstorm with the students. You could contrast ideas. You could have students take different sides of an argument and then discuss those sides, what's similar, what's contrasting. You could help them learn goal-setting behavior and say, we're going to work on various stages of a project that lead to the ultimate goal of a presentation. But along the way, we're going to establish goals and reach milestones that progress us through this process and help them understand, oh, I see that each step is a milestone. Help them understand emotions, how to think clearly about their emotions and become more rational and say, okay, when he said that, I got very angry and I reacted this way. Now let's step back and think about, okay, why did I get angry and how could I adjust my behavior and my attitude? So, very good, useful ways to address this new way of metacognition in young adolescent students. So what's the importance of a book like this to middle grade education and to developmentally responsive schools and teaching? I've got a few slides on that. So we know the adolescent brain is still developing, but eventually it will wire itself to become more structurally fixed and in place for adult life. Okay, so this is a unique time. Learning opportunities have huge consequences in their adult life while they're an adolescent or a young adolescent. So understanding this is hugely important to middle grade education. Studies show that unfortunately, most middle grade students are bored in class and they do not enjoy school. If that's the case, how is that going to wire their brain for their adulthood? Not well. We should be helping our children to be engaged in class and enjoy school. Here's a quote from Brandon Bustede, who's the executive director of Gallup Education. He says, if we were doing right by our students, this would not be so. Each year a student progresses in school, they should be more engaged and more interested, not less engaged. And so the suggestions in this book are helping us achieve that. He lists common practices currently in middle schools that are essentially hostile to the adolescent brain development. So he says, for example, if you have a zero tolerance on discipline, a zero tolerance on discipline policy in your school, well, that doesn't give an adolescent the opportunity to learn from a mistake and change or correct their behavior. So that's kind of hostile. It's, you know, one and done. Another example, an emotionally flat classroom experience suppresses the exuberance of a youthful limbic system, a youthful frontal cortex. That's the way these kids want to behave. They want to have fun in class and be laughing and talking and discussing and interacting. So you can't have an emotionally flat classroom if you expect that type of exuberance. Another is if we decide to ban social media applications in our class, well, that limits the opportunity to make them excited, the students, about collaborating using social media. Can't we design a way to do a project with social media? Otherwise, we impair their, if we give them more homework and longer school days and do things that create stress for them, that impairs their level of excitement, that impairs their mental and physical ability to learn and be healthy. if we're overly teacher-centered and not student-centered, if we're overly lecture-based and not discussion-based, if we're overly textbook-driven, we'll stifle the adolescent brain development and the way they want to learn and desire to learn. What we need to do is include more peer interaction, opportunities for self-actualization, decision-making opportunities, creative expression, and emotionally salient learning activities. Great suggestions. Finally, towards the end of the book, the author provides a resource for educators who want to implement school reforms like this that are developmentally responsive, but get some objections from maybe their peers at school. So what if a teacher comes up to you and says, hey, look, we don't have the time to do these reforms because we need to really focus on preparing the students for the standardized tests. They need better scores. Well, he gives you some suggested responses. Well, look, the evidence cited in the book says that if we do these reforms, it will raise the levels of academic achievement and test scores. Or another example might be, here's an objection. We can't depart from the dictates of the Common Core. He says, well, look, most of the ideas and strategies can be tied directly to the Common Core standards. Let's give it a chance. Another objection might be, we don't have the money to follow through with this. And so he says, look, many of the suggestions in this book don't really require extra funding, just the will to change and the will to improve. You don't have to spend money on a lot of these things. It's just the approach. The last objection I'll cite is, what if our school board and our administration won't support us in this? He said, well, individual teachers could work alone and make some incremental changes in their classroom and maybe record some of the progress and then go back to the school board and back to the administration and say, hey, look, a few of us did these things and here's the results. They're positive results. Maybe we could get your support to do some more. So he gives some good real world opportunities to advance these reforms. My recommendation is that this is a good book for educators to read. It contains relevant information, relevant suggested strategies for improvement, and they are research-based and sound. If you read it, you will learn about recent discoveries regarding the development of the adolescent brain and why that knowledge is important for us as educators. And even though this is highly intellectual subject matter, in particular at the beginning of the book, it's a very easy to read, easy to comprehend book. And several chapters 3 through 10, focus on how to improve classroom learning with basic interventions that are aligned to adolescent brain function. They should work really well, and they're very clear and they're very specific. The author provides evidence-based action steps that teachers can take and practical examples that have been used in other schools successfully to support this type of adolescent learning and development. So it's a really good book and I highly recommend it. And that's the end of my presentation. I appreciate your time. I hope it was interesting for you, and thank you very much.